She spoke her command. The cowboy couldn't breathe. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of golden sand and scattered sagebrush beneath the wide, pale sky. Heat shimmered off the ground in lazy waves, distorting the distant mountains until they seemed to dance on the horizon. It was the kind of day that made a person feel small against the vastness of the world, yet somehow connected to something larger than themselves. Jake Morgan had been riding these lands for the better part of 20 years. His weathered hands gripped the reins loosely as his horse picked its way carefully across the uneven terrain. The brown leather of his hat was stained with sweat and dust, shaped by countless days under the unforgiving sun. His vest, once a deep burgundy, had faded to the color of dried earth. Everything about him spoke of a man who had learned patience from the desert itself. But today, patience felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. 3 days ago, a woman had arrived. At the Clearwater Ranch where Jake worked as foreman, she'd come on foot, her dress torn and dirty, her dark hair wild from the wind. The ranch hands had found her collapsed near the well, half dead from thirst and exhaustion. When she finally opened her eyes in the bunkhouse where they'd laid her to rest, she'd looked around with the wariness of a cornered animal. Her name was Sarah. That was all she would tell them at first. Just Sarah. Now she rode beside him on the gentlest mare they had, her back straight despite the obvious discomfort of someone unaccustomed to horseback. She wore a simple brown dress they'd found for her, one that had belonged to the ranch owner's late wife. It fit her well enough, though it couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders or the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon as if expecting danger to emerge from the heat waves. Jake had volunteered to escort her to the nearest town. It was a 2-day journey each way, and he'd told himself it was just the right thing to do. A woman alone in this country faced dangers that could break a person's spirit, if not their body. But if he was being honest with himself, which Jake Morgan always tried to be, there was something about Sarah that had gotten under his skin from the moment he'd first seen her. Maybe it was the way she held herself. Broken, yes, but not beaten. Like a tree that had weathered a terrible storm, but still reached toward the sun. They'd been riding in comfortable silence for most of the morning, stopping only to rest the horses and share water from Jake's canteen. The town was still half a day's ride ahead, a small settlement called Cedar Falls, where Sarah could catch a stagecoach to wherever it was she was planning to go. She hadn't said, and Jake hadn't asked. Some stories came in their own time. That's the sun climbed higher. They found themselves in a stretch of desert where ancient rock formations rose like cathedral spires from the earth. Jake guided them toward a cluster of boulders that would provide some shade for the horses and a moment's respite from the heat. The silence between them had grown heavier with each mile, thick with unspoken words. Sarah dismounted carefully, her legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. Jake watched as she walked a few steps away from the horses, her hand pressed to the small of her back. When she turned around, he saw that her face was pale beneath the sun's bronze, and her dark eyes held a weight that seemed too heavy for someone who couldn't be more than Jake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound of his name on her lips made something inside his chest tighten. There's something I need to tell you. He'd been checking the horse's hooves for stones, but at her words, he straightened. Slowly, something in her tone made his throat go dry. You don't need to tell me anything you don't want to, Sarah. She shook her head, sending strands of dark hair across her face. No, I do. You've been nothing but kind to me, and you deserve to know what kind of person you're helping. Jake set down the horse's hoof and turned to face her fully. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her face, but he could see the struggle there. The battle between shame and the need to speak truth. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, during the darkest days of his own past. I'm listening, he said simply. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, even though the day was warm. For a long moment, the only sounds were the soft snorting of the horses and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she was afraid that stopping would mean never starting again. I was married, she said, to a man named Thomas Brennan. He owned a successful business in San Francisco, and when he asked for my hand, my father was so proud, said I was making a match that would secure our family's future. She paused, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. What my father didn't know was what Thomas was really like behind closed doors. Jake felt his jaw clench, but he remained silent, letting her find her own pace. At first, it was just words. Sarah continued. He'd tell me I was worthless, that I was lucky he'd married someone as plain and stupid as me. Then it became ... more. She touched her ribs gingerly, and Jake realized he was looking at old hurts, ones that had healed but left their mark. He said it was my fault. That I drove him to it with my failures as a wife. The desert seemed to hold its breath around them. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Sarah needed to tell this story, and he needed to let her tell it without his anger getting in the way. I tried to leave twice, she said, her voice growing stronger now, as if speaking the words was somehow freeing them from her chest. Both times, he found me and brought me back. The second time, she stopped, her hand instinctively moving to her throat where Jake now noticed the faint white line of an old scar. He told me that if I ever tried to leave again, he'd make sure I disappeared permanently, and he had the connections to do it. Jake's hands had curled into fists at his sides without his realizing it. He forced them to relax, focusing on keeping his breathing steady. What changed? He started talking about wanting children, Sarah said, her voice barely audible now, and I realized I couldn't bring a child into that house, couldn't let him hurt someone even more helpless than I was. She looked up at Jake then, and he saw tears trailing down her cheeks. So one night, when he was away on business, I took what little money I'd managed to hide, and I ran. I've been running for 3 months now. The silence that followed was profound. Jake felt as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. Not because of what she'd told him, but because of what he saw in her face when she finished speaking. She was waiting for him to turn away from her, expecting it, even as if the shame of what had been done to her was hers to carry. Sarah, he said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. He took a step toward her, then stopped when he saw her flinch slightly. Look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and Jake felt something break open inside his chest. It was a woman who had survived hell itself, who had found the courage to save not only herself but the children she might someday have, as she thought he would judge her for it. You listen to me, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of feelings inside him. What that man did to you wasn't your fault, not one bit of it, and the fact that you found the strength to leave, to keep yourself alive out here in this hard country, that doesn't make you shameful, Sarah, that makes you the bravest person I've ever met. Her face crumpled then, and she buried it in her hands. The sobs that came from her seemed to rise from someplace deep and long locked away. Jake stood there for a moment, torn between the desire to comfort her and the knowledge that she might not be ready for that kind of closeness. In the end, he did what felt right. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her time to move away if she needed to. When she didn't, he gently placed his hands on her shoulders. You're safe now, he said quietly. I don't know what the future holds, but right here, right now, you're safe. Sarah looked up at him then, her eyes red with tears, but clearer somehow than they'd been before. Why? She whispered. Why are you being so kind to me? Jake studied her face for a long moment. This woman who had trusted him, with her darkest secrets. The honest answer was complicated, full of feelings he wasn't sure he was ready to name. But there was a simpler truth underneath all of that. Because kindness shouldn't be something a person has to earn, he said, and because everyone deserves to be treated with respect, especially someone who's been denied it for too long. They stood there in the shade of the ancient rocks, two people who had found each other in the vastness of an unforgiving landscape. The desert stretched away in all directions, but for the first time since she'd begun her journey, Sarah felt like she wasn't running anymore. She was just moving forward. As they prepared to mount their horses and continue toward Cedar Falls, Jake found himself thinking about the future, about whether Sarah would truly leave on that stagecoach, or whether she might consider staying in a place where people understood that the measure of a person wasn't found in their worst moments, but in how they chose to face tomorrow. That the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. It would be a beautiful sunset, Jake thought, the kind that reminded a person that, even after the darkest night, morning always came again. Behind them, their shadows stretched long across the desert floor. Two figures who had shared truth under the endless sky, and found in that sharing something precious and rare. The beginning of healing,